the dark story of America's most mysterious Gatsby estate. It began not with blueprints or budgets, but with land, raw, wind-cut, untouched land that stretched along the north shore of Long Island like an unwritten promise. At the turn of the century, this coastline was still quiet, nothing more than scattered farms, drifting gulls, and narrow country roads that dissolved into grass. Wealth was arriving, but it had not yet taken root. New fortunes studied the shoreline the way generals study a map before a campaign. They were looking for elevation, for views that could not be challenged, for ground that announced distinction before a single stone was set. And among these slopes, coves, and bluffs, there was one parcel that stood apart, waiting for someone bold enough to claim it. The land rose gently from the harbor, forming a natural stage that faced both Manhattan's distant haze and the calm Connecticut shore across the water. It was sheltered by thick forest, yet open enough to carve panoramas of the Sound. Beneath the soil lay bedrock strong enough to hold weight, a crucial detail for anyone dreaming not of a cottage but of a monument. Surveyors noted the curve of the shoreline, the depth of the water, the way the wind moved across the hilltop. Every feature suggested potential beyond simple comfort. This place could frame a house that would be visible miles away, an estate that would dominate the horizon like a signature written in stone. When Clarence Mackay set foot on this land in 1899, he saw more than acreage. He saw a declaration waiting to be made. His fortune came from wires stretched across oceans, a modern empire built on speed and distance. But the old families of New York still judged lineage more than innovation. A powerful house could bridge that divide. He needed a location that wouldn't merely host a residence, but would project influence before a single guest stepped inside. The North Shore, with its rising bluffs and untouched vistas, offered exactly that, a landscape where new fortunes could write themselves into permanence while pretending they had always been here. Catherine, with her inherited pedigree and quiet assurance, recognized something else in the hillside. This was not Newport, burdened by long-established hierarchies and centuries-old expectations. Long Island still felt malleable, open to reinvention, a terrain where old bloodlines mingled with new capital and pretended it was destiny, not convenience. From the crest of the hill, the world below seemed orderly, even obedient, as if the land itself anticipated the arrival of something extraordinary. For Catherine, whose upbringing had taught her the language of social position, the height of the ground mattered just as much as its beauty. Homes built on this kind of elevation were not simply seen, they were obeyed. Together, they imagined a house that would not blend into the shoreline, but define it. The property, 216 acres at first and later expanded, offered enough space to build not only a residence but an entire environment, a crafted universe where architecture, gardens, terraces, and views would merge into a single narrative of prosperity and certainty. Standing on the ridge, wind pulling at Catherine's veil, Clarence shielding his eyes from the glare of the Sound, they believed in the old fantasy that stone could hold happiness, that height could ensure safety, that a home built large enough, strong enough, and beautifully enough might freeze time itself. Yet even in those early hours, as surveyors placed their stakes and the couple walked the boundaries of their chosen kingdom, the dream was already evolving into something larger. They were no longer choosing land for comfort. They were choosing ground for impact. Harbor Hill would not be constructed to shelter a family. It would be constructed to announce one. The hilltop demanded a house that did not sit on the landscape but ruled it. And in that demand lay the first quiet shift, from building a home to crafting a symbol, one that would only grow louder as the first plans were drawn and the foundations began to take shape. Their partnership was never just a romance. It was a merger of worlds that had spent generations circling each other at a careful distance. Clarence brought a fortune carved from modern invention, copper wire stretched under oceans, telegraph stations humming with messages that crossed continents in minutes. His wealth was immense, radiant, but undeniably new. Catherine, by contrast, arrived with something money alone could never buy: generational credibility. Her lineage reached back into early American history, tied to families whose names were spoken in drawing rooms with a mixture of admiration and caution. She carried the quiet authority of someone whose ancestors had shaped society long before industrial riches reshaped America itself. When the two married, they ignited a conversation that could not be contained within any city ballroom. Their union represented a fusion of ambition and heritage, and such a fusion demanded a physical counterpart, something grand enough to harmonize their differences and declare their combined place within the nation's upper echelon. A modest house would have been an insult to Catherine's background, and a wasted opportunity for Clarence's rising stature. They did not need a home. They needed a stage capable of broadcasting who they had become together. Catherine had grown up in spaces where architecture signaled identity as clearly as clothing or manners. Houses in her world were messages carved into stone, expressing rank, taste, and permanence. For her, Harbor Hill could not be a simple seaside retreat. It had to embody refinement, tradition, and the quiet power of an old family name. Clarence, meanwhile, approached the concept with the strategic mind of a businessman. The house had to be unmistakable, a structure large enough that newspapers would mention it, that guests would remember it, that rivals would measure themselves against it. It had to look like destiny fulfilled, not fortune recently acquired. Together, they envisioned walls tall enough to silence any whisper that their worlds did not belong together. Their marriage needed a setting that made unity appear effortless, a place where lineage and industry could meet without conflict. Every social expectation, every unspoken hierarchy, every silent judgment that hovered over their union demanded a counter-argument made of limestone, marble, copper, and glass. The house would not merely shelter them, it would legitimize their partnership. It was Catherine who insisted on something elegant, controlled, and European in spirit, a structure worthy of the old dynasties she descended from. Clarence wanted scale, spectacle, and the unmistakable weight of the modern prosperity. The only way to satisfy both visions was to build not a residence, but a palace, an estate that could stand beside the great houses of Newport and the European villas that inspired America's elite. For a dream of this magnitude, they needed a builder with a vision equal to their aspirations. Not simply an architect, but a cultural force, someone capable of taking their marriage, with all its expectations and contradictions, and translating it into stone. And so, inevitably, all roads led to the man whose name alone carried the power of its own dynasty, a figure whose buildings commanded respect before anyone stepped inside. The moment they chose the architect who would shape Harbor Hill, the project stopped being personal and became monumental. Stanford White arrived not as a contractor summoned for a routine commission, but as a force of nature stepping into a landscape waiting to be transformed. His reputation had reached mythic proportions by the time Clarence and Catherine approached him. To hire White was not simply to hire talent. It was to align oneself with the man who had reshaped New York's skyline, whose touch could turn stone into narrative and symmetry into authority. He carried an aura that made even the wealthiest patrons defer with a mixture of reverence and ambition. When White walked the crest of the hill for the first time, he did so with the calm certainty of someone who already sensed what the land wanted to become. He studied the slope, the curvature of the shoreline, the fall of light at different hours of the afternoon. His eye registered details others overlooked, how the treetops framed the horizon, how fog rolled across the harbor, how the wind carved patterns through the tall grass. He absorbed the landscape the way a composer listens to silence before writing a first note. Clarence spoke of grandeur, Catherine spoke of heritage. White listened to both, then let the land itself speak the loudest. Harbor Hill, he understood instantly, was not a place for modest gestures. It demanded a structure powerful enough to anchor the view and refined enough to avoid overwhelming it. His early sketches unfolded like declarations. He envisioned an estate that merged the ease of American living with the disciplined harmony of European architecture. The house would borrow the vocabulary of Renaissance villas, clean lines, classical proportions, expanding terraces, yet translate them into something distinctly American, lighter and more confident, without the heaviness of old-world ceremony. White ignored the temptation to imitate Europe directly. Instead, he distilled its essence and placed it in dialogue with the openness of the New World. The result would be a building that felt familiar to Catherine's lineage, yet entirely suited to American ambition. He drafted elevations where the mansion rose with deliberate symmetry, a central block commanding the hilltop, wings stretching gracefully outward, windows arranged with mathematical precision, and terraces stepping down toward the water like a series of theatrical stages. Every angle offered a view designed with intention. Every doorway aligned with a vista. Every corridor anticipated movement. The house would not simply sit on the hill, it would direct the experience of approaching, entering, and living within it. White's handwriting covered the margins with calculations, ratios of height to width, spacing between columns, ideal room volumes, silent proof of a mind that used precision to create emotion. Catherine responded with immediate awe, Clarence with firm approval. White had created what they themselves could not articulate, a home that embodied their union and elevated it. Here, American success would be expressed through European refinement, and European refinement would be refreshed by American scale. The balance was delicate, but White held it with absolute command. As plans refined into blueprints and blueprints into construction schedules, the hilltop transformed into a buzzing organism of preparation. Surveyors plotted lines across the grass. Engineers examined soil depth. Foremen marked the future footprint of walls that would soon rise like a palace above the sound. The first deliveries of stone were scheduled, the initial labor crews assigned, temporary roads mapped into the woods. And when the final design was approved, every detail aligned, every proportion confirmed, the moment arrived that changed the hill forever. Its stakes were driven into the earth, boundaries traced in chalk and twine, and the future Harbor Hill stood like a ghost on the landscape, visible only to those who could imagine what Stanford White had already seen in his mind. The construction was ready to begin. The hill that once whispered with wind and birdsong soon thundered with human intention. What had been a quiet rise above the harbor was transformed almost overnight into a sprawling open-air encampment, a temporary city built for one purpose: to raise a monument that would outlive the hands constructing it. Before a single stone could be set, the land had to be conquered. Dense forest covered most of the acreage, with oaks older than the Republic and maples thick enough to withstand coastal storms. White's plan required precision, not destruction. Workers cut with restraint, leaving chosen trees to frame future vistas, carving pathways through the undergrowth, as if sculpting the landscape rather than clearing it. The first mornings of the project were filled with the sound of axes striking wood, horses straining at harnesses, and the low rumble of early steam equipment dragged onto the site. The aroma of fresh-cut timber drifted across the harbor as trees fell one by one, opening the sky and revealing the contours of the hill that would soon cradle the estate. Temporary roads were laid over soft soil, forming arteries through which the lifeblood of the project would flow: materials, tools, and the movement of hundreds of laborers who turned the site into a hive of controlled chaos. As the clearing expanded, surveyors set their instruments along the ridge, their tripods standing like skeletal sentinels against the sky. They mapped depth, slope, and angles, marking where the massive foundation would root itself into the earth. Excavation teams followed, their shovels and steam shovels biting into the hilltop. Horses hauled away heaps of soil to create level platforms for terraces and courtyards, while foremen shouted instructions over the groan of machinery. The deeper they dug, the more the land revealed its character: solid bedrock, the perfect anchoring point for a structure meant to defy time. Then came the materials. Rail cars unloaded shipments that seemed almost theatrical in their variety. Indiana limestone, cut to specification. Oregon timber so dense it rang like metal when struck. Belgian glass wrapped in sawdust, and copper coils shipped from distant smelters. Each piece arrived with notes, drawings, or numbers corresponding to White's meticulous plans. Crates from Italy, France, and Pennsylvania lined the makeshift roads, forming corridors of stone and timber awaiting their transformation. Workers built temporary sheds for cutting, shaping, and sorting, and the hill began to resemble a vast workshop exposed to the sky. The labor force expanded weekly. Masons, carpenters, engineers, iron workers, plasterers, and laborers from dozens of backgrounds speaking a symphony of languages. They lived in boarding houses across nearby towns or slept in rough shelters near the site to avoid long travel. Their routines were grueling. Dawn arrivals, long hours of hauling, hammering, chiseling, lifting, and aligning. Pay varied, loyalty fluctuated, but the momentum of the project pulled everyone forward, Progress carried risk, and the hill demanded its price. One barge overturned while carrying copper flashing across the harbor, dragging a young laborer into the water before anyone could pull him free. His name appeared briefly in the payroll ledger and lingered longer in the memories of those who worked beside him. There were crushed fingers beneath stone blocks, strained backs from lifting timber, and falls from scaffolding before safety rails were standard. Yet each accident tightened the bond between workers and deepened their resolve. They were building something immense, something none of them would ever own, but all of them would leave imprinted with their sweat and skill. Despite the hardships, victories punctuated the toil. When the first limestone block was set onto the foundation, workers paused to watch it settle with solemn pride. When the retaining walls began rising along the terraces, the hill revealed new faces, sharper and more defined. And when the outline of the central facade finally emerged from the tangle of scaffolding, even the most hardened laborers stepped back to marvel at the scale of what they were creating. By the time the last trees were felled and the cranes stood ready over the foundations, the land no longer resembled the quiet slope that Clarence and Catherine first walked. The hill had been awakened, reshaped, and prepared. The skeleton of the estate was ready to rise, and from this moment onward, Harbor Hill would no longer be a dream pressed onto paper. It was beginning to grow upward, stone by stone, into the physical world. As the foundation settled into the hill and the raw earth hardened beneath scaffolding, Harbor Hill began to rise in a language spoken not through words, but through geometry. The facade was the estate's first true declaration, a disciplined arrangement of stone and symmetry that would announce its presence long before anyone stepped inside. The workers approached this stage with a mixture of exhaustion and awe, for they understood that everything built so far had been preparation. Now the hill would reveal what all that labor had been preparing for. The terraces came first, carved into the slope with almost ceremonial precision. They descended in 3 grand steps from the rear of the house toward the harbor, each platform wide enough to host crowds or frame silence, depending on the moment. Limestone balustrades traced their edges, creating an architectural rhythm that echoed across the water. From these terraces, the views expanded in sweeping arcs, west toward Manhattan's faint skyline, north across the Sound to Connecticut, and eastward over rolling land that seemed to bow toward the estate. The terraces were more than landscaping. They were a stage, a controlled descent from cultivated grandeur to open sea. The facade itself began as a skeleton of scaffolding, then slowly clothed itself in limestone. Workers lifted block after block, aligning each piece with mathematical precision, so the building would appear effortless despite the millions of pounds of stone holding it upright. The central block rose high above the wings, its height chosen not for extravagance, but for authority. White understood the psychological power of symmetry. A perfectly balanced facade creates a sense of inevitability, as if the building had always belonged on the land. He used this principle to give Harbor Hill the illusion of permanence, an effect both Clarence and Catherine craved, each for their own reasons. Tall arched windows dominated the first floor, flooding the major rooms with sunlight and framing views that stretched miles across the water. Above them, rectangular windows marked the private quarters, smaller and more restrained, a visual cue that the public grandeur below was matched by careful order above. On the top floor, the windows shrank again, announcing the presence of servant spaces without ornament or pretense. The house, even from the outside, revealed its hierarchy with elegant honesty. The roofline added another layer of power. Copper tiles, shipped across the country and hammered into place by craftsmen who understood the art of weathering, created a shimmering crown atop the estate. In a few years, the copper would soften into green, giving the mansion the patina of age even as it remained youthful. 4 chimneys rose like sentinels above the roof, their height and proportion designed to reinforce the vertical thrust of the central block. Seen from the harbor below, the chimneys gave the impression of a fortress, unmovable, unchallenged, a statement carved against the sky. Every angle of the exterior was orchestrated to communicate stability. Every proportion calibrated to strike a balance between American boldness and European lineage. The house was not merely large, it was composed, intentional, and unyielding. From the bottom terrace, the mansion towered like a vision from a previous century. From the approach road, it appeared gradually. First a roofline, then a corner, then the full facade emerging as if performing a slow reveal. Even the approach was designed to impress, turning arrival into theater. But the facade was only the beginning. For all its stone and symmetry, Harbor Hill's true power lay inside. The moment the exterior reached its full form, attention shifted to the world behind those towering arched windows. Workers removed scaffolding and cleared debris, preparing pathways for artisans who would soon bring the house to life from within. The interior promised something the facade could not: movement, light, emotion, and the kind of architectural storytelling that would leave guests breathless. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise on a world even more grand than what could be seen from the harbor. Inside Harbor Hill, grandeur did not simply continue, it intensified. Crossing the threshold felt less like entering a home, and more like stepping into a world designed to immortalize its owners. The entrance hall rose in a sweep of paneled oak, its walls separated by carved pilasters that drew the eye upward toward a coffered ceiling, patterned with geometric precision. Light poured down from high windows and hidden fixtures, giving the hall a glow that shifted throughout the day, from cool morning tones to warm amber evenings. Guests often hesitated here, caught between admiration and disbelief, as if the room itself insisted on a moment of acknowledgement before allowing passage deeper into the estate. The grand staircase dominated the hall like a sculptural spine. Its wide, ascending sweep was encased in oak paneling that mirrored the hall's design while amplifying it. The banisters appeared to float, each section a delicate lattice of carved detail that seemed too intricate to support weight, yet strong enough to endure centuries. Sunlight from a skylight 3 floors above slid down the walls in gentle beams, illuminating every carved leaf, every polished surface. Ascending the staircase felt ceremonial, as if each guest were being ushered upward into a realm reserved for privilege. Beyond the stairs, the main hall stretched toward the rear of the house, its chevron-patterned floors pulling visitors toward distant windows that framed the harbor like moving paintings. A massive fireplace, legend claimed it was large enough to burn an entire tree, anchored the room. Its mantel, carved with motifs inspired by French cathedrals, reminded visitors that the owners did not merely purchase luxury, they curated heritage. Above, a balcony overlooked the hall, its railings crafted from choir stalls salvaged from a French church, giving the impression that the house itself carried echoes of earlier eras within its bones. The drawing room unfolded in a burst of elegance. Modeled in the style of Louis XV, it shimmered with gilded trim, set against white panels so bright they seemed almost luminescent in natural light. Mirrors lined the walls from floor to ceiling, multiplying chandeliers into constellations that danced across the surfaces. During gatherings, the room could transform into a ballroom, the polished floors reflecting candlelight and silk gowns in a spectacle that blurred the line between real life and stage performance. Across from the entrance hall, the billiard room presented a masculine counterpoint: deep oak paneling, an oversized marble fireplace, and walls decorated with trophies, maps, and heirlooms. It radiated a sense of private power, a chamber where deals could be whispered over glasses of brandy or debated in the soft glow of evening lamps. Adjacent to it lay the dining room, a space that blended restraint with extravagance. French antiques stood beneath an intricately crafted ceiling, while long windows opened the room to the evening light. When the table was set for 40 guests, silverware gleamed like a regiment of polished steel. Further inside, a library offered a quieter grandeur. Leather-bound volumes lined the shelves, and heavy curtains framed windows that looked out over carefully trimmed gardens. The room exhaled the perfume of paper, wood polish, and the faint scent of roses carried in from the outdoor terraces. Nearby, a dedicated armory displayed suits of armor and medieval weapons collected from estates across Europe, an unexpected reminder that the Macays were building not only comfort, but legacy. Art filled the hallways and salons. Renaissance pieces attributed to Botticelli, Bellini, and Raphael, along with meticulous copies so expertly done they were nearly indistinguishable from originals. Everywhere the eye moved, beauty waited. Rooms were arguments in architecture. Each one declared the Mackay's prosperity, taste, and ambition in a different dialect of luxury. And yet, the house was not only meant to be seen, it was meant to be heard. Its marble floors were tuned to echo footsteps in dignified rhythms. Its ceilings were shaped to capture conversations and let them drift. The music room, with its perfect proportions and carefully engineered acoustics, would soon welcome voices so powerful they could fill the space without amplification. Harbor Hill was ready not just to impress, but to resonate, ready to turn gatherings into performances and nights into memories carried far beyond the estate's limestone walls. The first gatherings at Harbor Hill were careful, almost rehearsed, as if the house itself were testing its voice before singing at full volume. The earliest dinners brought together editors, architects, and patrons, people whose approval could ripple through the highest circles of New York society. They arrived in carriages that rolled up the mile-long drive, their wheels crunching over gravel illuminated by lanterns set at strategic intervals. When the doors opened, the house greeted them with a glow that made everything seem sharper, richer, almost staged. The aromas of French sauces drifted through the corridors, mingling with the faint scent of polished oak, fresh flowers, and candle wax. Even then, guests sensed they were entering a place built not simply to host events, but to perfect them. As the seasons turned, the gatherings grew bolder. The Mackays discovered that Harbor Hill was not just a residence, it was an instrument. The music room, with its carved moldings and acoustics tuned under the consultation of experts from Carnegie Hall, became a sanctuary for sound. When Enrico Caruso arrived in 1906 for a private recital, the house responded as if it had been waiting for him. His voice filled every corner, vibrating through plaster and marble, carrying all the way out to the terrace where guests stood breathless under the night sky. Those who could not fit inside pressed near the open French doors, unwilling to miss a single note as the sound spilled toward the gardens like warm light. In that moment, Harbor Hill proved it could hold not only people but emotion. Music turned into architecture. Then came the grander spectacles. Summer balls where orchestras of 20 or more musicians filled the air with waltzes that rolled up the staircase and swirled through the halls. Carriages lined the driveway in staggered glittering rows, their lamps forming constellations along the maple-lined approach. Inside, guests glided through rooms that seemed designed for movement, golden reflections shimmering in mirrors, soft footsteps echoing across polished floors, laughter rising like champagne bubbles. The dining room hosted dinners that stretched for hours, each course more elaborate than the last, each vintage chosen with meticulous care. When midnight approached, French doors opened onto the terrace, revealing views so breathtaking they silenced entire crowds. Harbor Hill became a machine of luxury, calibrated down to the smallest detail. Staff rehearsed their duties like performers preparing for a premiere. Waiters moved with precision that suggested choreography. Footmen opened doors at the exact pace that preserved the illusion of effortless grace. The gardens, lit by rows of lanterns, created a silent audience to the house's nightly performances. Even the breeze off the harbor seemed to cooperate, carrying music across the water toward towns where people could only imagine the wonders unfolding on the hill. As the invitations expanded, so did the prestige of the guest list. Pilots, diplomats, financiers, and artists passed through the entrance hall, leaving behind stories that would live longer than the estate itself. F. Scott Fitzgerald attended gatherings along the Gold Coast, never in Harbor Hill's inner circles, but close enough to catch its glow. From across the water, he watched the lights shimmer on warm nights and imagined what sort of life must unfold inside a house that seemed built for legends. Yet, while music flowed and laughter echoed across the terraces, the very scale that made Harbor Hill magnificent also began to reveal its weight. Behind the radiant facade, subtle distances opened between the people who lived there. Servants whispered about rooms that remained dark for weeks at a time, or about quiet dinners taken separately. The house, so alive during the grand events, fell into long silences when the guests departed. Even as it dazzled the world outside, Harbor Hill began to feel the first faint vibrations of tension, small, almost imperceptible shifts that hinted that the music, as powerful as it was, could not drown out everything forever. And as the final notes of each evening faded into the harbor air, the estate stood in stillness, beautiful yet burdened, waiting for the next great night, while something unspoken started to take shape behind its glowing windows. The glitter of Harbor Hill could blind a guest, but it could not blind the people who lived within its stone walls. As the years progressed, the perfect symmetry of the facade began to contrast sharply with the quiet asymmetry of life inside. The same rooms that once pulsed with orchestras and laughter now held long stretches of silence. Silence that settled into corners, along stair rails, beneath chandeliers, as if the house itself were absorbing tensions its owners refused to name aloud. Clarence and Catherine, once united in ambition, began drifting along separate orbits that rarely crossed. Their public appearances continued with practiced grace, but behind the carved doorways and mirrored halls, they inhabited different worlds. Servants noticed first. They always did. Breakfast trays were carried to different rooms. Letters were delivered discreetly to separate desks. Even the echo of footsteps changed, no longer in unison, but in alternating rhythms, one ascending the staircase as the other disappeared down a distant corridor. Certain rooms became territories. Catherine gravitated to the morning room, filling it with correspondence, books, and visiting intellectuals whose quiet conversations gave her a sense of stability. Clarence claimed the study, where the scent of cigars and the soft glow of desk lamps became his form of sanctuary. The grand hall, once a shared heart of the estate, grew colder between gatherings. Its enormous fireplace lit more for display than comfort. Other rooms fell into disuse entirely. Servants dusted the drawing room's gold-trimmed panels even when no one entered for weeks. The library's heavy curtains remained closed unless a guest requested a tour. The billiard room's polished cues waited untouched. Even the balcony overlooking the main hall, once a place where Catherine paused to watch the bustle of events below, stood empty, its vantage point witnessing nothing but still air. The ballroom, designed to house hundreds, began to echo differently. Parties continued, but the energy lacked the effortless enchantment of earlier years. Guests would comment on the beauty, yet servants felt the subtle stiffness in the air, the way conversations slid away from personal matters, the way laughter seemed slightly rehearsed. Harbor Hill, always grand, now carried an undercurrent of unease like music played in the wrong key. The separation between husband and wife deepened until it became part of the house's architecture. They dined at different hours. They traveled separately. Their children learned which hallways to avoid when tension grew thick. What had once been a palace of celebration slowly learned the contours of disappointment, its lavish spaces becoming witnesses to small disagreements, quiet resentments, and the exhaustion of maintaining appearances. Even the acoustics, so carefully engineered to carry Caruso's voice across the terrace, revealed truths. Sound moved differently when a home lacked unity. Conversations died quicker. Doors closed louder. The grand staircase, which had once amplified footsteps in proud, welcoming rhythms, now magnified the distance between two people walking alone. All of it unfolded while the outside world remained mesmerized by the estate's beauty. From beyond the gates, the hill still looked enchanted. From across the water, the lights still glittered with promise. And among those watching was a young writer renting a modest home in Great Neck, a man who spent evenings staring toward the great houses across the bay, imagining the lives within. F. Scott Fitzgerald did not need to walk Harbor Hill's rooms to feel its contradictions. The glow of its facade, contrasted with the growing silence behind it, created a tension he understood instinctively, and as he observed the shimmering Gold Coast nights, the divide between appearance and reality began to shape a story that would one day outlast even the walls of Harbor Hill itself. From across the water, Harbor Hill looked less like a residence and more like a promise, glittering, unreachable, suspended between wealth and longing. F. Scott Fitzgerald, living in a modest rented house on the opposite shore, saw the estate not through invitations, but through distance, which gave him something more powerful than access: perspective. At night, he listened to faint orchestras drifting over the sound, watched the reflection of hundreds of lights shimmering on the water, and imagined the world unfolding inside halls he would never enter. The illusions cast by these mansions were irresistible to a writer who understood that the difference between aspiration and reality was often only a thin pane of glass. He walked along the shoreline in the evenings, taking mental notes on how the lights rose and fell with the hum of parties, how laughter seemed to dissolve into the night air, and how these houses, Harbor Hill foremost among them, radiated confidence even when the people inside felt none. He recognized the performance of wealth because he too had performed it. What enchanted him most was not the gold or the music, but the tension beneath it, the way grandeur hid uncertainty. Harbor Hill embodied that contradiction perfectly. A palace built to announce invincibility, even as its owners struggled privately in rooms meant to symbolize harmony. Fitzgerald visited other estates as well, estates where motor cars lined circular drives and orchestras played until dawn, but none occupied the landscape the way Harbor Hill did. Its elevated perch made it appear almost mythic, as if it were the source of the Gold Coast's radiance rather than a participant in it. When he began drafting a novel set among these coastal fortresses, he blended impressions from many places, yet Harbor Hill provided the template for scale, ambition, and theatricality. Gatsby's mansion, with its endless parties and dazzling lights, carried the silhouette of Harbor Hill, even if its architecture differed on the page. But Fitzgerald grasped something deeper, the tragic gravity of houses built to impress rather than to comfort. From his vantage point, he sensed the weight behind the brightness, the pressure on families to sustain illusions, the toll of appearances that demanded constant upkeep, the quiet fractures that widened behind carved panels and mirrored halls. Harbor Hill's beauty masked strain. Its lights projected joy, even as rooms inside grew quiet. And those contradictions became the heart of the story he was writing, a world where the pursuit of perfection leads to longing and where the glow of a dream hides shadows too deep to ignore. As Fitzgerald's vision sharpened, the myth of Gatsby began to grow. It grew from the shorelines, from the outlines of palaces glimpsed at sunset, from whispers of extravagant parties attended by people who chased a feeling they could never fully grasp. While he wrote, Harbor Hill continued to gleam across the water, its facade still magnificent, its terraces still immaculate. Yet beneath the surface, the reality of the estate had already begun to dim. Maintenance costs rose, staff numbers fell. The energy that once electrified its hallways grew thinner, stretched between public presentation and private exhaustion. The novel would someday become immortal, but the real house that helped inspire it was already stepping into a more fragile chapter. The music that once defined Harbor Hill still drifted across the sound, but its notes carried newer undertones, less triumph, more weariness. And as Fitzgerald's fictional palace grew legendary on the page, the true estate that mirrored its spirit began, quietly and inevitably, to fade. By the end of the 1920s, Harbor Hill still shone outwardly, terraces trimmed, windows flawless, gardens sculpted with almost military precision. But the brilliance had become a mask stretched thin over a growing void. The Gold Coast had always thrived on illusion, wealth presented as eternal, comfort performed as natural, grandeur displayed as if it carried no weight. Yet illusions falter when the world shifts underfoot, and the shift came violently. The stock market crash of 1929 did not merely shake fortunes, it rearranged the architecture of American life. And on Harbor Hill's limestone terraces, that tremor echoed louder than guests could ever imagine. Clarence had inherited an empire built on cables laid across the Atlantic, a business whose prosperity depended on the steady exchange of messages between continents. But as markets collapsed, companies slashed communication costs, governments seized control of strategic industries, and investors abandoned long-term trust for short-term panic. Revenue from the telegraph empire fell sharply, and the financial buffers that once had seemed indestructible thinned with alarming speed. Clarence had always managed adversity through expansion, reinvestment, and sheer endurance, but the Depression was a different kind of adversary, one that cut from every direction at once. For the first time since the mansion's completion, the arithmetic turned hostile. Harbor Hill required a torrent of money simply to remain operational. Its lawns consumed endless labor. Its rooms demanded constant heating. Its terraces needed meticulous upkeep. Its staff, dozens of gardeners, maids, footmen, cooks, drivers, and maintenance workers, relied on salaries that had never been questioned until suddenly they were. Property taxes climbed relentlessly, not because the estate gained value, but because the county viewed such houses as immovable targets. Land might depreciate, buildings could not be hidden. Harbor Hill, with its terraces, stables, greenhouses, and long driveway, became a magnet for assessments that rose even as the family's income fell. Clarence resisted change at first. Parties continued, though smaller. The orchestra shrank, though it still played. Dinners grew simpler, though silverware still gleamed, but the illusion grew harder to maintain with every passing month. Behind closed doors, budgets were reconsidered. Staff whispered about possible reductions. Repair requests were postponed, then postponed again. The wine cellar stopped expanding. The flower orders shrank. The seasonal hiring never returned to its earlier scale. Harbor Hill, built to express boundless prosperity, was entering a period where every decision revealed limits. Then the first closures began. Quiet, almost invisible, like the initial symptoms of an illness no one wanted to diagnose. Guest rooms were sealed for the season. Then one wing of the house. Then a block of servants' quarters. The enormous ballroom, once the epicenter of lavish festivities, hosted fewer gatherings, until eventually it remained dark for months at a time. The staff noticed how the air in unused rooms grew colder, how echoes lingered where furniture had been removed, how certain hallways no longer smelled of polish because no one walked them anymore. The estate's decline was not dramatic, but slow, inevitable, and painfully visible to those who knew what to look for. A small leak in the roof took weeks longer to repair than it once would have. The gardens lost a gardener here, then another. The maple-lined driveway, once maintained with unbroken perfection, began developing patches of gravel that waited too long for replacement. The Great Hall still impressed visitors, but the energy behind its grandeur had shifted. Instead of radiating confidence, the house seemed to brace itself against the future. By the early 1930s, Harbor Hill was still massive, still beautiful, still visible from miles away, but it had become a weight rather than a triumph. The building that once embodied ambition now demanded sacrifices that drained the family's resources and tested their resolve. Every month required calculations, compromises, and quiet acknowledgments that perfection was no longer sustainable. And as the estate shrank from within, closing rooms like a body conserving warmth, Harbor Hill entered a new phase of its life, one defined not by creation, but containment. The palace built to symbolize permanence was discovering how quickly magnificence could turn into burden. The next chapter would reveal just how much the house could endure before the walls themselves began to surrender. Harbor Hill entered the 1930s like an aging monarch, still imposing, still commanding the horizon, yet hollowed in ways only those closest could see. The grandeur remained intact at a distance, but up close the estate had begun to shed its illusions, room by room, hallway by hallway, as though the house itself were retreating from the life it once contained. What had been a palace of light now drifted steadily toward shadow, becoming a kind of architectural ghost long before its stones ever faced demolition. The first hints were subtle. A guest wing quietly shuttered for a season, simply never reopened. Furniture was covered in linen, chandeliers remained dark. Servants who once polished every corner now found themselves tending only to select rooms, the ones still in use, the ones that mattered. Where once the house required nearly 40 staff members operating in synchronized precision, it now ran on a skeleton crew. Gardeners disappeared first, leaving terraces a touch less immaculate. Housemaids followed until entire corridors stood untouched for weeks, their silence broken only by the occasional footstep of someone passing through on an errand. The ballroom, once the heart of the estate's most spectacular nights, fell into a long sleep. Its gilded moldings dimmed under a thin haze of dust that no one had time to fully clear. Curtains drawn to save warmth turned the room into a cavern of shadows. The echo inside changed, no longer exuberant, no longer buoyed by music and conversation. It carried a faint, hollow note that hinted at absence. Even the parquet floor, once polished for dancers and orchestras, creaked more sharply as if announcing its disuse. In the library, leather-bound volumes remained perfectly aligned, while the air grew still. The billiard room, stripped of its nightly gatherings, began to feel like a museum to an earlier era. The drawing room, with its mirrors, gilded surfaces, and pastel panels, became almost surreal without movement to animate it. And the great staircase, once a ceremonial passageway for guests in glittering attire, now heard mostly the soft tread of a butler or the faint echo of a caretaker doing rounds. The shrinking household had a rhythm all its own. Staff who remained often out of loyalty rather than necessity, spoke of long, quiet evenings when the house seemed too vast for the number of people inside it. Sound traveled differently through underheated halls, doors closed with sharper resonance. Footsteps ricocheted off marble floors in ways that emphasized emptiness rather than grandeur. Even the fireplaces, once symbols of warmth and abundance, crackled rarely, and only in rooms the family still used. Clarence moved through this changing world with increasing fatigue. His study, once a command center of business decisions and correspondence, became a refuge reduced in scale. Bills, legal papers, and letters concerning the troubled telegraph industry stacked higher each month. Catherine, now living largely apart, returned only for obligations, not for comfort. Their children, once central to the estate's vibrancy, had grown into separate lives, leaving the echoes of their laughter drifting through rooms they no longer inhabited. Despite all this, Harbor Hill remained physically imposing. Its terraces still overlooked the Sound with the same regal stance. Its limestone walls still caught the evening sun in warm gold. But its spirit had shifted. What guests once called a palace felt increasingly like a monument waiting for its final line in history. The estate endured not through vitality, but through inertia, a structure too large, too heavy, too deeply rooted to collapse quickly, yet no longer alive in the way it once had been. The house stood, but it stood the way abandoned theaters do, grand in outline, hollow in atmosphere, a stage without actors. Its beauty no longer dazzled, it lingered, and beneath the surface of that lingering, an unavoidable truth grew clearer with each passing season. Harbor Hill's time was running out. The estate was not just struggling, it was slipping quietly toward a fate that no grandeur could prevent. Soon the final years of its owner's connection to the estate would reveal just how fragile even the grandest dreams become when their foundation is no longer wealth, but memory. In its final years as a private residence, Harbor Hill felt less like a home and more like a vast relic inhabited by a dwindling cast of figures trying to hold back an incoming tide. What had once been a lively estate of orchestras, dinners, and glittering crowds turned into a labyrinth of quiet rooms, legal papers, and unresolved obligations. The halls still carried the scent of polished oak and distant sea air, but beneath that lingered something heavier. The slow accumulation of years in which hope stretched further than means. Clarence remained the estate's last constant presence, though even he lived in only a fraction of the rooms he once commanded. His health faltered under the strain of declining fortunes and the unrelenting weight of maintaining a place built for an entirely different era. Doctors visited regularly, their recommendations gentle but firm. He ignored most of them. Harbor Hill had become not just his residence but his final responsibility, a towering reminder of his family's rise and a burden he felt obligated to shoulder, even as the strain grew more visible. Legal disputes gathered like storms on the horizon. His first marriage had long ago shifted from estrangement into formal separation, creating a maze of obligations, settlements, and contested interpretations. Catherine's life continued largely away from the house, shaped by agreements that divided property and responsibility, with a precision almost as complex as the estate's own architecture. Their children, now adults with families and ambitions of their own, circled the situation cautiously, aware that the legacy they stood to inherit was weighed down by the same magnificence that once elevated their parents. When Clarence remarried, the alliance brought brief flickers of companionship, but not permanence. His second wife, an accomplished soprano accustomed to cities and stages, preferred Manhattan's pulse to the solitude of an estate growing colder by the year. Their lives drifted into parallel paths, intersecting enough to honor the appearance of unity, yet separate enough to leave Harbor Hill increasingly isolated. The house absorbed their distance in its own silent way, transforming empty chambers into reminders of what had once been full and alive. Attempts to preserve the estate continued, despite shrinking funds. Clarence fought property tax assessments, appealed to the courts, negotiated with local authorities, and tried to restructure his business holdings to free resources. Each effort bought time, but only time. Repair requests stacked up. Roof leaks demanded attention one room at a time. Plaster cracked in upper corridors no one visited anymore. Garden walls began to lose their crisp edges as creeping vegetation reclaimed the space. Yet the estate still carried moments of dignity, final sparks of the grandeur that had once defined it. One last holiday dinner brought a small circle of longtime friends and family to the great hall. The table was shorter, the menu simpler, the wine poured more sparingly. But for a brief evening, the chandeliers glowed again with warmth rather than memory. Servants moved quietly, filling glasses and carrying plates with the same professionalism they had once shown to crowds of hundreds. In the gentle light, it was possible to imagine that the house still had a future, that the walls could hear laughter without immediately echoing it back as something fragile. After the guests departed, the house felt colder than before. Clarence lingered a while in the great hall, staring up at the ceiling where the warm flicker of firelight reflected on carved panels. It was said later that this was the last night he walked the main floor with the same deliberate pride he had held in the estate's early years. In the weeks that followed, his health declined sharply, and the rhythms of life at Harbor Hill slowed until the staff recognized what the house itself seemed to know. The era had reached its end. When Clarence passed, the estate slipped fully into limbo. Ownership transferred in fragments among heirs, executors, and trustees. Court filings stretched across months. Decisions about preservation or sale tangled with personal histories and financial strain. Meanwhile, the house continued to stand, its rooms dark but intact, waiting for someone to choose a direction. Potential buyers appeared intermittently, developers with bold plans, institutions exploring possibilities. But none saw the mansion as a home. They saw land value, acreage, subdivision potential. They saw obstacles rather than legacy. The first proposals carried an unspoken message that soon became explicit. The estate could not be saved as it was. Harbor Hill, once a beacon of ambition, now faced its final chapter, not with celebration, but with pragmatism. And as the legal dust settled and inquiries multiplied, the first whispers emerged, quiet but unmistakable, hinting that its towering walls, its terraces, its grand staircase, and the entire world it represented might not survive the decisions looming ahead. In the years following Clarence's passing, Harbor Hill stood in a strange half-life, too grand to ignore, too burdensome to maintain, and too expensive for any heir to rescue. Its terraces still caught the afternoon sun, and the limestone facade still displayed the calm authority envisioned by Stanford White. Yet beneath that beauty lay a financial reality that made the estate less a heritage and more an anchor, dragging the family legacy down with it. What had once symbolized triumph now demanded resources no one could provide. The first attempts to sell the property were cautious, almost hopeful. Executors and family members listed the estate with the expectation that its beauty, history, and prestige would attract a rare buyer with both means and sentiment. But the world had shifted. Large estates were no longer symbols of modernity. They were reminders of an era collapsing under its own weight. Few wanted the responsibility of 80,000 square feet of limestone chambers. Fewer still were willing to inherit the costs associated with the staff, upkeep, and taxes of a mansion built for a lifestyle that no longer existed. The asking price dropped once, then again, then again, each reduction cutting deeper into the illusion that the house retained its former value. The market saw not beauty, but burden. Buyers walked the empty halls with polite interest, noting the craftsmanship while calculating the expenses. The gardens were admired but viewed as obligations. The terraces, once platforms for celebrations, were now measured in potential redevelopment plots. Even the panoramic view that had attracted Clarence decades earlier became a footnote compared to the escalating costs of maintenance. By the mid-1940s, the estate's value had collapsed to a fraction of its original cost. Developers circled the property not because they wanted to save the house, but because they wanted the land beneath it. They saw the acreage, the proximity to the harbor, the potential for dozens of modern homes to replace a single aging palace. To them, Harbor Hill was not a monument. It was in the way. One developer stepped forward with a proposal that was both practical and devastating. He offered to purchase the entire estate, but only on the condition that the mansion would be removed. It was too large, too costly, too outdated for contemporary buyers. The house, once a symbol of American ambition, had no place in a world turning toward smaller suburban living. Its terraces were too grand, its ceilings too high, its systems too old. Its magnificence had become its own undoing. The offer was low, shockingly so for an estate that had cost millions to construct, but it was the only offer that came with a concrete plan. The heirs, weary from years of taxes, legal fees, and endless negotiations, faced a choice that felt less like a decision and more like surrender. To keep Harbor Hill was impossible. To sell it intact was improbable. To sell the land meant accepting that the house, its history, its artistry, its echoes of music and celebration would not survive. Eventually, practicality outweighed sentiment. The deal moved forward, and the estate changed hands. The developer made his intentions clear. The mansion would be cleared to prepare the land for new construction. Salvage crews arrived first, walking through the darkened rooms with notebooks, marking which elements could be removed and resold. Marble mantels were labeled. Chandeliers were lowered and packed into crates. The banister of the grand staircase, once a centerpiece of the home, was measured for dismantling. Outside, demolition teams prepared charges and equipment. The hilltop that once rang with orchestras and laughter now echoed with the metallic clatter of tools and the hollow thud of dismantled stone. The final decision had been made, and it required not ceremony, but machinery. Dismantling gave way to destruction. The estate that once inspired awe would soon face the indifferent force of dynamite. And as preparations intensified, Harbor Hill stood silent, awaiting the final moment when the weight of its ambition would meet the blunt reality of progress, its towering presence reduced to dust, clearing the ground for a future that no longer needed palaces. The dismantling of Harbor Hill began without ceremony. No final gathering on the terrace, no farewell toast beneath the chandeliers. Instead, trucks arrived at dawn, engines humming in the cool morning air, carrying crews whose task was not to preserve a legacy, but to clear an obstacle. The estate that once symbolized ambition, artistry, and extravagant hope was now approached with the clinical efficiency reserved for condemned structures. Workmen walked through the silent halls with pencils tucked behind their ears, taking inventory of what could be salvaged and what would be reduced to rubble. Inside, the process was precise and strangely intimate. The drawing room's gilded mirrors were carefully removed, their surfaces still capable of reflecting a world that no longer existed. Marble mantels, carved with an artistry that once took artisans months to perfect, were pried from the walls and lowered onto padded crates. The great staircase, one of Stanford White's masterpieces, was measured plank by plank, then dismantled like a giant puzzle, its graceful banisters wrapped and sold to antique dealers who knew their value even when the house that held them no longer could. Workers moved through the ballroom, library, and study with the steady rhythm of professionals completing a job, their boots scuffing floors that had once known polished shoes and swirling dancers. The estate's interior disappeared piece by piece. Doors were unhinged, windows were pulled from their frames. Chandeliers descended from ceilings that had once amplified Caruso's voice. The music room, a marvel of acoustics and ornament, fell silent as plasterwork was chipped away, and delicate moldings were numbered for removal. The gardens outside, long untended, watched in stillness as the palace they once framed was taken apart from within, like a memory quietly erased. When the salvage was complete, what remained of Harbor Hill was a hollow shell, its bones exposed, its grandeur stripped. The terraces still faced the harbor, but without the house behind them, they seemed less like elegant platforms and more like abandoned platforms overlooking a view that had lost its meaning. The scaffolding went up one last time, not to build, but to dismantle, wrapping the mansion in a lattice of wood and iron that foreshadowed the final act. Then came the machinery. Excavators lumbered across the grounds, their arms swinging with mechanical indifference. Walls that had withstood storms and winters for decades yielded in seconds. Limestone blocks tumbled down with a sound like distant thunder. Dust clouds rose into the air, drifting across the hill in thick gray waves that coated the grass, the trees, and the once perfect driveway. Neighbors watched from afar as fragments of carved stone and shattered plaster rolled down the slopes. The detonation itself was scheduled on a cold morning. The crews drilled charges into the foundation, threading wires through cracks and anchor points. Instructions were shouted, distances measured, safety zones marked. Those who had worked on the salvage stood back, helmets in hand, waiting for the signal. The hillside, once alive with candlelight and music, held its breath. A deep rumble tore through the ground as the charges ignited. The central block collapsed inward first, sending up a plume of dust that blotted out the sky for a moment. The wings followed, settling into piles of broken limestone and splintered timber. The facade that had once greeted statesmen, musicians, and socialites folded into fragments. The terraces trembled but held, their stone edges overlooking a crater where the mansion had stood for nearly half a century. By afternoon, Harbor Hill was no longer a house. It was debris, piles of shattered stone, twisted copper flashing, and splintered beams. Trucks moved in, hauling away what remained. The hill was leveled, reshaped, prepared for its new purpose. In a matter of months, the last identifiable pieces of the estate were gone, replaced by survey stakes marking the outlines of future neighborhoods. All that remained were scattered memories, photographs in family albums, archived drawings in libraries, fragments sold to collectors, and a lingering question that hung over the empty hilltop. How could a palace built to last forever vanish so completely, so quickly, so quietly? The answer lay not in the rubble, but in what came next, a reckoning with the idea of permanence itself, and the realization that the only part of Harbor Hill capable of surviving was the story it left behind. What endured after Harbor Hill's fall was not its stone, nor its terraces, nor the glittering world it once commanded, but the echo of what it had represented. When the last trucks left the hill and the dust finally settled, all that remained of the mansion were fragments scattered across time. A carved mantel in an antique dealer's catalog, pieces of the grand staircase repurposed in private homes, bits of limestone embedded in the soil where children would one day play. The estate that had once dominated the horizon now existed only in the delicate custody of memory. Archives became the new rooms of the house. Floor plans, blueprints, and letters preserved the outlines of its ambition. Photographs captured the estate at its peak, carriages lined along the drive, chandeliers blazing above ballroom crowds, Catherine and Clarence posing in carefully arranged tableaux that hid the fractures beneath. These images, stored in museums and historical collections, preserved details that no witness could recall with perfect accuracy. The sheen of the oak paneling, the precise angle of the terraces, the way light fell into the music room at sunset. Through them, Harbor Hill continued to breathe, even without walls. Its most enduring legacy, however, appeared in a place few expected: literature. Fitzgerald's novel, shaped in part by the lights he saw shimmering across the water, transformed the real Gold Coast into a mythic landscape. Gatsby's mansion, fictional, fluid, symbolic, absorbed pieces of Harbor Hill's grandeur and tragedy, then projected them into something immortal. While the estate itself crumbled into dust, the image it helped inspire lived on in millions of copies of a book read across decades. Gatsby's parties never ceased, his lights never dimmed, his story was revisited, reinterpreted, reimagined endlessly. Through fiction, the essence of Harbor Hill survived in a form more resilient than stone. Its disappearance also awakened something unexpected, a cultural awakening to the fragility of architectural heritage. The loss of Harbor Hill, along with dozens of other Gold Coast estates in the mid-20th century, ignited movements dedicated to preservation. Organizations rallied, historical societies mobilized, and laws changed. Places that once seemed destined for demolition were instead recognized as irreplaceable artifacts of American history. Some were repurposed as museums or cultural centers. Others found new life as public parks or educational institutions. Each success carried a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost, of what had vanished before society realized it needed saving. Harbor Hill became a cautionary tale whispered through preservation circles. Its fate demonstrated that no amount of beauty or craftsmanship could guarantee survival once the world around it changed. Wealth shifts, priorities evolve, and the infrastructure of an era often becomes unsustainable in the next. The mansion that once symbolized permanence had proved itself vulnerable to the simplest forces: taxes, utility bills, shifting cultural tastes, and the relentless march of modern development. Its fall illustrated a truth that grand houses rarely admit while standing. Magnificence does not make a thing immortal. And yet, even in ruin, Harbor Hill achieved something remarkable. It joined the realm of legends, not through survival, but through absence. Its story, its creation, its brilliance, its silence, its end, became larger than the building itself. People still seek out its photographs. Historians study its plans. Readers connect it with Gatsby's world. Preservationists cite it as a turning point. Architectural students learn its name long after the last stone left the hillside. So, what truly remains of the palace that sparked a literary myth and once commanded the Gold Coast? A collection of images, fragments of marble, entries in archives, chapters in textbooks, a caution to those who build monuments and those who assume monuments will stand forever, and an enduring question that outlives the structure itself, lingering like a final note from the music room's vanished performances. Why did the myth endure when the house could not? Why did the fictional mansion remain vibrant while the real one disappeared from the map? Perhaps because stone can only withstand weather, while stories survive everything else.